blood soaked through the buckskin at her side, and still she swung a knife at the man who would one day become her husband. Holt Bishop had ridden deep into the San Mateo Mountains of New Mexico territory, searching for nothing but silence, and instead knelt in the pine needles in front of a fierce, wounded Apache woman who would rather die fighting than accept a stranger's help, a woman named Winona who was about to change everything he understood about strength and about love. This was the New Mexico territory in the autumn of 1884, high country where a man could ride for 3 days and see no roof but the sky. Holt had come up into the San Mateos to be left entirely alone, and Winona had come up running from men who meant to finish what they had already started on the people she loved. What began with a blade at his throat would end with the two of them standing together against the very riders who had put that blood on her side, and before it was over, Holt would have to decide whether solitude had ever really been what he wanted at all. Watch till the end to see how a fierce, wounded woman who trusted no one taught a grieving man how to want a life again, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more Wild West love stories. The wind came down off the San Mateo peaks that October morning carrying the smell of pine sap and old smoke, and Holt Bishop, 4 days out from the nearest town and glad of every mile of it, rode with his hat brim low and his mind carefully, deliberately empty. He was 34 years old and had buried a wife and a 5-year-old son within the same terrible week. 2 winters back, a fever that had swept through the valley and taken half the children in it, and he had spent the 2 years since learning that a man could keep working a ranch with a hole punched clean through the middle of him. So long as he never stopped moving, long enough to feel the wind pass through the gap. Neighbors meant well. Neighbors brought pies and soft words and eyes that filled up with pity the moment they looked at him, and Holt had reached the point where their kindness felt heavier than any grief he could have carried alone. So when the fall roundup finished, he let his foreman know he'd be back inside 2 weeks, and rode for the highest, emptiest country he knew. The town of Magdalena had watched him grieve for 2 years with the particular attention small towns reserve for a tragedy they can't quite stop discussing, and Holt had grown so tired of walking into the mercantile and feeling every conversation soften and lower the moment he crossed the threshold, than go himself. It wasn't that the town meant him ill. It was the opposite, a kindness so constant and so careful it had begun to feel like a hand pressed permanently against a bruise, reminding him at every turn of exactly what he'd lost, and Holt had come to understand, somewhere in that second long winter, that the only cure available to him was distance. To enough of it that grief could simply be a private thing again, carried quietly, instead of a subject the whole valley felt entitled to discuss over coffee. Rachel had been the one who wanted a ranch of their own, rather than a smaller spread closer to town, walking the boundary line with him, the spring after their wedding, and choosing the exact rise where the house should sit, because the morning light came up gold over the eastern ridge, and she wanted to wake to it every day of her life. Holt had built that house with his own hands the summer before their son Daniel was born, had hung a rope swing from the big cottonwood by the creek a full year before there was any child small enough to use it, certain in the easy, arrogant way of young husbands that there would be years and years to fill it with laughter. The swing still hung there, untouched, the summer of the fever and the 2 summers after. He could not bring himself to take it down, and he could not bring himself to push it either, so it simply hung still in a yard that had gone quiet around it, a small, useless monument to a future that had stopped arriving. He made camp for 3 nights beside a creek, so cold it numbed his hands to fill a canteen, and for the first time in 2 years, he found something close to peace in the sound of nothing at all. No condolences, no careful silences at the supper table where his wife Rachel used to sit, no small shoes by the door that he still hadn't found the will to move. This, he decided, was all he wanted. A man, a fire, a mountain that didn't know his name and didn't care what he'd lost. He was 3 days into believing it when his horse threw its head up hard on the morning of the 4th day and would not be calmed, ears pinned toward a stand of scrub oak on the slope above, and Holt, who had ridden that horse through worse country than this, swung down and went to see what had spooked it with his rifle already loose in his hand. He found the blood first, dark spatters on pale rock that any man raised on a cattle range knew how to read, and followed it up through the oak brush with his pulse climbing until he came on her wedged into a hollow between two boulders, one arm pressed hard against a wound low on her side that had already soaked through what was left of her sleeve. She was young, younger than he'd expected, with her black hair matted with dust and dried blood at one temple, and the moment his shadow crossed her, she came up off the rock with a hunting knife in her free hand and murder in eyes that were even glazed with pain and blood loss, sharper and steadier than Holt expected from anyone at death's door. She hissed something low and fast in a language he didn't know, and he understood every word of it anyway, from the set of her jaw alone. Come one step closer, and I will put this blade through you before I let you touch me. Holt had grown up on a range that bordered Chihan land, had traded at the same posts, and heard the same stories every rancher in that territory had heard about raiders, and captured women and men who wore no uniform but did worse than any soldier, and he understood. Watching her brace herself against the rock, with a blade shaking in a hand that had lost too much blood to hold it steady much longer, exactly what kind of fear he was looking at. He raised both hands slow, palms out, and set his rifle down in the dirt between them, an offering she did not trust for one heartbeat. She lunged anyway, weak as she was, and the blade caught his forearm in a shallow line before he got a grip on her wrist and held it there, not hard, just held, while she fought him with everything a wounded body had left to give, twisting, spitting a word that needed no translation, driving her knee into his ribs hard enough to fold him half over, even as her own legs buckled beneath her. She went down when her strength finally ran out, rather than because he'd beaten it out of her, and Holt caught her before her head could crack against the rock, lowering her the rest of the way himself while she still tried, weakly, uselessly, to pull the knife back toward him one last time. Up close, the wound at her side was worse than he'd thought, a gash that had been bleeding for hours by the look of the ground around her, and Holt made a decision, in about the length of time it took to draw one breath. He was not going to ride away from a dying woman, whatever it cost him in knife cuts to give it to her. He tore his own shirt into strips right there, packed the wound as tight as he dared, and when her eyes fluttered open once more, glassy but still furious, still tracking the knife she no longer had the strength to reach for, the only words he had were low and even the way he'd once gentled a spooked horse. "I'm not one of them. I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't believe him. He could see that plainly in the way her whole body stayed rigid, even as consciousness slid away from her again. But she stopped fighting long enough for him to get her up onto his horse and back down to his camp before full dark closed in over the ridge. That first night, Holt slept sitting upright against a boulder 10 careful feet from where he'd laid her, his rifle across his knees, not because he feared her, a woman that badly wounded could barely lift her head, but because he understood, the way any decent man ought to, that a woman who'd fought him half to death rather than be touched needed to wake up and see for herself that he'd kept his distance. She woke twice in the night with a start, hand flying to her side where the knife should have been, and both times found it gone and found him sitting well back from her, with his own hands empty and visible in the firelight, and both times she went still again, watching him with an animal wariness that never fully closed its eyes. By the gray hour before dawn, her fever had broken enough that she could speak in halting, careful English, learned by her own flat account from a mission school she'd been forced into as a girl and had never once been grateful for, and the first full sentence she managed was not a thank you. It was a warning. "Untie me and give me back my knife, or I will find a way to kill you myself before the men who did this to me arrive and do it for me." Her name was Winona, and it took the better part of 2 more days, spoken in short, furious bursts, whenever the pain let her talk at all, for Holt to piece together what had happened to her. She was Chihan, born into a band that had spent 2 generations being pushed from one patch of ground to another by agents and soldiers and settlers who wanted the water beneath their feet, and 6 days before Holt found her, a company of riders under a man named Garrett Cole had come down on her family's camp before sunrise, men who worked for no army and obeyed no law, gathering horses and captives to sell south of the border to ranchers who paid well and never looked twice at where they came from. Winona's father had died defending the camp long enough for half the band to scatter into the hills. Winona herself had been struck and dragged toward a wagon meant to carry her and 3 other women south, and had put a knife into the man holding her rope before she ran, taking a bullet across her ribs for her trouble as she went. She had been running and hiding for 6 days on almost no food. Certain Cole's men were still combing these mountains for the woman who'd escaped them, when Holt's horse had very nearly walked past the hollow where she'd finally collapsed. She did not soften toward Holt for telling him this. If anything, she seemed to sharpen, watching him across the fire with the particular contempt of someone who expected pity and would rather have been left to die than receive it. And when he proposed riding her down to the nearest army post for protection, she laughed once, short and humorless, making plain that soldiers had done nothing for her people in living memory, and she'd sooner trust the mountain lions. What she needed, once the fever cooled enough that she could think past it, was time and a horse and enough distance from Holt's cabin and Holt's questions to find what remained of her scattered band before Cole's riders found her first. Holt pointed out as gently as a man could point out anything to a woman still gripping a skinning knife under her blanket at night, that she couldn't outrun 6 armed men on foot with a wound that had barely stopped bleeding, and that whatever she thought of him personally, his cabin had walls and his rifle had bullets. She did not thank him for the offer. She simply grudgingly agreed to stay until she could walk a full day without the wound, reopening in not 1 hour longer, and Holt, who had wanted nothing this whole trip but silence and solitude, found himself agreeing to exactly the opposite without entirely understanding why. The uneasy bargain they struck held through the first difficult week, mostly because neither of them had a better option. Holt moved his camp down to a line shack he kept stocked for winter roundups, a single sturdy room with a good door and a spring close by, and Winona spent those first days flat on the narrow cot, glaring at the rafters and testing every few hours whether her legs would carry her weight yet. She refused broth twice before hunger won out over pride. She refused his help, standing 3 times before her own knees betrayed her, and she had to grab his arm to keep from going down. And each time she did it, she looked so furious at her own body for needing him that Holt had to turn away to keep from smiling. He was beginning to understand, not a woman who softened when she was frightened or weak. She sharpened. Every small defeat her body handed her seemed to feed some deeper, colder resolve, and Holt found that harder to walk away from than any amount of gratitude could have been, because it was the first thing in 2 years that had made him curious about another human being instead of merely tolerant of their presence. The days settled, in that first hard week, into a rhythm neither of them named out loud. Holt changed the dressing on her wound every morning, and every evening his hands as careful and impersonal as he could make them, and Winona endured it with her jaw locked tight and her eyes fixed on some middle distance past his shoulder, as though enduring the touch of his hands was a separate labor from the pain of the wound itself. She ate what he cooked without comment the first 2 days, then began, by the 3rd, correcting him: too much fat in the broth, not enough salt in the beans, the coffee bitter enough to strip hide. Criticisms delivered so flatly he couldn't tell for a long while whether she meant them as insult or as the closest thing to conversation she had left in her. He came to understand it was both and neither, and that arguing with her about coffee was strangely the first thing that made the line shack feel less like a sick room and more like 2 people sharing a roof. He learned her competence before he learned much else about her. On the 4th day, still moving stiffly, she took his good knife off the table without asking, went out the door before he could object, and came back an hour later with a rabbit cleaned and ready for the spit and a look daring him to comment on it. On the 6th day, she caught his wrist hard enough to bruise it, and hauled him back a full stride from a patch of ground near the spring that looked to his eye like solid earth, and turned out to be a shallow sinkhole hidden under a crust of pine duff that would have dropped him to his knee and very possibly broken it. She didn't explain how she'd known. She simply released his wrist and walked on, leaving behind only the flat observation that the ground here lies the way a man's face lies when he's about to cheat you, and Holt standing there with the distinct, humbling sense that he had needed rescuing at least as often as she had, and that pretending otherwise would only insult them both. Winona's competence extended past tracking and knife work into a whole quiet knowledge of the mountains that Holt, for all his years running cattle through them, had never once possessed. She showed him, without much ceremony, which of the tall yucca stalks could be roasted into something almost sweet if a person knew how to build the pit right, which bark eased a cough, and which one taken wrong could stop a heart. Knowledge passed down to her the same way her mother's healing had been. Hand to hand across generations of women who could not always count on a doctor or a trader being anywhere near when the sickness came. Holt in exchange showed her the particular stubbornness of cattle, how to read a storm building over the western ridge 2 full hours before the sky gave any obvious sign of it, small trades of competence that neither of them treated as charity, because both of them understood, by then, that they were simply two capable people filling in each other's gaps, the way any good partnership eventually does. They began in the second week to trade words the way children trade marbles, small and careful and half in jest. She taught him the Apache word for fire, for water, for the particular kind of quiet a person kept when listening for danger, and mocked, without much mercy, his flat rancher's tongue every time he mangled the sounds. He taught her, in turn, a handful of English words she claimed to already know from the mission school, but which she nonetheless let him repeat anyway, sitting close enough by the fire on cold nights that he could feel the warmth coming off her, though she was always careful, always precise about never quite closing that final foot of distance between them. She still slept with a blade near her hand. She still watched the tree line every dusk with an attention that never fully relaxed. But somewhere in that second week, the silence between them stopped being the wary, bristling silence of two strangers and became something else. A silence Holt found himself, to his own considerable surprise, not wanting to fill with talk at all. Holt caught himself, more than once in that second week, doing something he hadn't done in 2 years, noticing. He noticed the particular way Winona tilted her head when she was listening for something beyond the range of his own duller ears, noticed the small private satisfaction that crossed her face whenever a snare came up full, noticed that he had stopped counting the days until his planned return to the ranch, the way he had at the start of the trip. He had built a careful, deliberate wall around himself in the 2 years since the fever, brick by brick, out of the honest conviction that wanting nothing meant he could lose nothing further, and it troubled him in the quiet hours before dawn to feel that wall developing cracks he had not given anyone permission to make. He did not know yet what to do with the noticing. He only knew that he had stopped trying very hard to stop it. She tried to leave once in that second week, before her legs had any right to carry her that far. Holt woke before first light to find the cot empty and her boots gone from beside the door, and he caught up to her, less than a mile down the game trail, moving slow and grim, with one hand pressed hard against her healing side, sweat standing out on her forehead despite the cold. She did not apologize for going. Breathing hard and leaning against a pine with the particular stubbornness of someone determined not to let her body's weakness show, she got out that she had woken from a dream of her father's camp burning and understood, with total clarity, that staying near a rancher's cabin was only going to get him killed the same way it had gotten her father killed, and that she would rather leave on her own 2 feet than watch it happen to one more person who'd been foolish enough to help her. Holt didn't argue with the dream. He simply walked beside her in silence for a while, matching her slowed pace, until her own legs finally gave out from under her, and she had to let him half carry her back, furious and silent the whole way, and it was that walk back, more than any conversation before it, that seemed to teach her something had already shifted between them that neither of them had agreed to. If a story like this one is the reason you keep finding your way back to this channel, we would be glad to have you closer than that. Tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It costs very little, and it helps us keep bringing you stories exactly like Holt and Winona's. She opened up about her mother one night, unprompted, the words coming slow and unpracticed, as though she hadn't spoken them aloud since the fire that had likely killed the woman she was describing. Her mother had been a healer, known through 3 bands for knowing which roots eased a fever and which ones stopped a bleeding wound, and Winona had learned at her side since she was old enough to carry a basket, knowledge that had almost certainly saved her own life in that hollow between the boulders, packing the wound herself with crushed yarrow before her strength gave out. She touched on her father, too, briefly, bitterly, a proud man who had refused 3 separate times to move the band further into land nobody wanted, holding firm that his people had already given up enough ground for one lifetime, and who had died standing between Cole's riders and his own people rather than run. Holt did not reach for sympathy, because he had learned by then that sympathy only made her retreat further behind her walls. He gave her instead his own loss, plain and unadorned, a fever, a small coffin. He'd built himself because he couldn't stand the thought of a stranger's hands on it, a silence in his house that had driven him up into these mountains, looking for a silence he could stand to live inside. Winona listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she only allowed that grief did not care whether a man's skin was pale or brown, and that she was sorry for his boy. 3 words Holt had not expected from her, and he had not realized until that moment how badly he'd needed to hear them. A storm caught them in the 3rd week, a hard, early blizzard that came down off the peaks with almost no warning and pinned them both inside the line shack for 2 full days while snow piled against the door. It was the closest quarters they'd shared since that first terrible morning, and Winona, restless with confinement, spent the first hours pacing the small room like something caged, until Holt, without much thinking about it, handed her a deck of worn playing cards his father had left him. She beat him at it 4 times running, laughed at him outright the 3rd time, a short startled sound she seemed almost as surprised by as he was, and by the 2nd night of the storm, with the fire burned down low and the wind howling outside, she had stopped watching the door every few minutes, the way she had every night before. She fell asleep sitting upright against the wall sometime past midnight, and Holt, rather than wake her to the cot, simply banked the fire, pulled the blanket up over her shoulders without letting his hand linger, and sat up the rest of that night the way he'd sat up that very first one, only this time it wasn't her he didn't trust in the dark. It was himself. And how much he had come in 3 short weeks to want to stay. On the morning the storm finally broke, Winona came to him in a voice quieter than any he'd heard from her, yet wanting help to build a small fire apart from the cabin, out where the new snow lay unmarked. She would not fully explain what the fire was for, only that it was the season, her father's memory, required a proper tending, a private grieving custom of her band that she had feared, until that morning, she would never get the chance to keep. She burned a lock of her own hair and a strip of cloth torn from her ruined dress, voiced words in her own language that Holt did not press her to translate, and stood a long while afterward watching the smoke climb into a sky scrubbed clean by the storm. Holt stood a respectful distance back the whole time, saying nothing, offering nothing, and when she finally turned from the ashes, her eyes were wet in a way she made no attempt to hide from him for once, and she allowed only that it helped a little to grieve a father, and that she was grateful he hadn't pressed her to explain any of it before she was ready to give it. Holt understood that, better than she likely guessed. He had never once let anyone watch him grieve Rachel and Daniel properly, not even himself, and something about standing witness to hers, quiet and unintrusive, felt like the first honest morning he'd allowed himself to be near in 2 years. She did not melt even then. Winona woke before dawn, found the blanket, found him still awake across the room, and rather than softness, what crossed her face first was suspicion, a sharp question about why he'd sat up watching her all night, and Holt too tired and too far past pretending to lie about it, and that she could take that however she pleased. She studied him a long moment with those dark, unflinching eyes, weighing the answer the way she seemed to weigh everything, and then aloud, with no particular gentleness in her voice at all, that a man who watched over a woman all night without once trying to touch her was either a fool or something rarer. It was, Holt would realize much later, the closest thing to tenderness she knew how to offer, wrapped so tightly in challenge that a lesser man might have missed it entirely. But Holt had spent 3 weeks learning to read her, and he heard it exactly for what it was. The trouble came back into their lives on a clear, cold morning in the 4th week, when Winona, out checking a snare line she'd set near the tree line, went still as stone and dropped flat behind a deadfall with a hand signal Holt had learned by then meant danger, don't move. She'd cut sign a 1/4 mile off, the fresh tracks of 6 shod horses moving in the careful spread formation of men who were hunting rather than traveling. And when she described the lead rider's mount to Holt that evening, a big grulla gelding with a distinctive split ear, her whole body had gone rigid. It was Cole's horse. Cole himself was still combing these mountains for the one captive who'd escaped him. 6 weeks and God knew how many miles later, and he had somehow, whether through luck or a tracker's patience, narrowed his search down to the exact stretch of high country where Holt's line shack sat. Winona wanted to run that same night alone if she had to, rather than let Cole's men find her anywhere near a white rancher's cabin and risk Holt's life alongside her own. And the argument that followed was the first genuine fight they'd had since the knife. She made plain, flat, and furious that she would not be the reason another man died protecting her the way her father had, that she had buried enough people already for one lifetime and would rather face Cole alone in the open than watch it happen again inside walls she'd come to care about. Holt, for his part, had spent 3 weeks relearning how to want something, and he made clear, with a steadiness that surprised them both, that he was not about to hand that back to a man like Cole without a fight. He pointed out that a lone woman on foot in open country stood far less chance against 6 mounted men than the 2 of them did together, with walls, a good rifle, and a spring that meant they could hold out longer than Cole's patience would last. She argued another hour before her own good sense won out over her pride, and what finally settled it more than any argument Holt made was the simple fact that she'd looked at him across that fire and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than Cole ever had, that she did not actually want to leave him behind either. A single rider found the edge of their camp the following dusk, a scout sent ahead of the main party to confirm the sign before Cole committed his whole crew to the climb, and it was Winona who spotted the glint of his spyglass from the ridge above the spring a full 1/4 hour before Holt would have noticed anything at all. She did not panic. She moved Holt back inside the tree line with 2 fingers pressed briefly to his chest, circled wide and silent through brush. Holt would have sworn couldn't hide a rabbit, and came back an hour later with the scout's own rifle in her hands, and a grim, unreadable look that made plain everything Holt needed to know without a single word passing between them. The man would not be reporting back to Cole. It bought them, by Winona's flat estimate, perhaps 2 days before the rest of the party grew impatient enough to come looking for their missing scout themselves, and those 2 days, by her own flat reckoning, were every bit of the warning they were going to get. They spent the next 2 days preparing the only way 2 people with almost no resources could, reinforcing the shack's single door with a crossbar Holt cut from a fallen pine, moving the horses into a brush corral where they'd be harder to spot from a distance, and laying out every round of ammunition Holt owned along the windowsill where Winona, who it turned out could shoot nearly as well as she could track, refused to be positioned anywhere but there, rather than being tucked away somewhere safe. Holt tried once, gently, to suggest she take the horses and slip away during the fight while he held the door, and the look she gave him in response needed no translation at all. She had not survived 6 days alone in these mountains, with a bullet wound in her side, by letting other people fight her battles for her, and she was not about to start now, for him or anyone else. He did not raise the suggestion again. Cole's crew, Winona had warned him during those 2 tense days of preparation, was not made up of soldiers or lawmen who might hesitate at the sight of a white rancher standing between them and their prize, but of men who had been doing this ugly, profitable work for years, hardened by it. Paid well enough by ranchers south of the border that a single rancher's cabin in the high country would not slow them for long. She had seen 4 of their faces already in the raid on her father's camp and could describe each one in flat, exact detail. A memory she clearly wished she did not carry so precisely, and she made plain to Holt that surrender was never going to be on the table for either of them, whatever these men promised through a door. Because a man like Cole did not leave loose ends, walking around free to testify to what he'd done. Cole's riders found the shack on the morning of the 2nd day, 6 men fanning out through the trees with the unhurried confidence of hunters who had never once lost a chase they'd committed to, and Garrett Cole himself, a lean, sun-cured man with a voice like dry leather, hollered from beyond rifle range that he'd come for what belonged to him and would take the rancher's scalp along with the woman's if it came to that. Winona's answer was to put a round through his hat before he finished the sentence, close enough to part his hair that his own men laughed nervously behind him. And the fight that followed was not the slow, grinding siege Holt had half braced for, but something faster and more desperate. Riders charging the shack in waves, while Holt and Winona traded the 2 good rifles between the door and the window, holding a line that would not have held an hour without her steady, unhurried aim, picking men from their saddles at a range Holt himself could never have managed. The first charge broke against the shack's reinforced door, without a single rider getting closer than 30 feet, Winona's rifle finding a shoulder and then a horse's foreleg in the space of 2 breaths, while Holt held the window with a discipline he hadn't known he still had in him, firing only when a target held still long enough to be worth the round. Cole pulled his men back after that first failed rush, cursing loud enough to carry, and for a long, ringing quarter hour, nothing happened at all beyond the wind and the smell of burnt powder. A silence Winona warned him not to trust for 1 second, because a man like Cole did not retreat, he only reloaded his plan, and it was Winona who saw the 2nd wave circling wide to fire the roof, a tactic her own people had suffered from more than once, and it was her sharp warning and faster reflexes that got Holt away from the window and the wall beam an instant before a bullet meant for his head instead tore through the space he'd occupied a heartbeat earlier. Holt in turn took a rifle ball, meant for her, across the meat of his shoulder when Cole himself got close enough to the door to fire through a gap in the crossbar, a wound that spun him half around and dropped him to 1 knee, and it was Winona screaming a word he didn't need translated, who put herself directly between him and the door and emptied the last of her rifle's rounds into the gap before Cole's men, having lost 3 riders and their leader's nerve, along with a fair portion of their number, finally broke and rode for open country rather than lose more men. The silence after they'd gone was almost worse than the fighting, the 2 of them alone amid spent shells and splintered wood, Holt bleeding badly from the shoulder and Winona kneeling over him with hands that would not stop shaking now that the danger had actually passed, packing the wound with the same practiced competence she'd once used on her own. She worked in silence for a long while, her jaw tight, and when Holt, half delirious with pain and blood loss, wondered weakly why she looked so furious when they'd won, she confessed, her voice breaking for the first time since he'd known her, that she was not furious, she was terrified. Because somewhere in the last 4 weeks she had stopped being able to imagine these mountains without him in them, and she did not know what to do with a fear that large after spending her whole life training herself not to need anyone that badly again. There was hard, practical work still ahead of them, even after the danger passed. 2 of Cole's men lay dead in the yard and had to be buried, a grim task Holt undertook alone while Winona rested, because whatever those men had done, she saw no honor in leaving even a bad man for the coyotes, and Holt found he agreed with her, however little either of them owed the dead any tenderness. A 3rd man, wounded and left behind in the retreat, surrendered what remained of his nerve entirely, and it was Winona, again, who extracted from him, calm, methodical, without needing to raise her voice once, the names of the ranchers south of the border who had been paying coal to keep the wagons of captives coming. Information Holt later carried to a federal marshal in Socorro, who for once proved willing to act on it. It would take the better part of a year for that information to close down 2 more crews running the same ugly trade elsewhere in the territory, a slow, unglamorous justice that Winona took no particular satisfaction in, only a grim sense that it was owed. Holt healed slowly through the weeks that followed, the wound in his shoulder stiff and aching but clean, and it was during that recovery, tending each other's small hurts by the same fire where they'd once eyed each other across a knife's distance, that both of them finally put into words what neither had dared to name through a month of fierce, tearful proximity. Winona, blunt as always, admitted that she had expected, when Cole's riders came, to lose him the way she had lost her father, and that the fear of it had taught her more about her own heart than 4 weeks of quiet fireside talk ever had. Holt returned just as plain a truth that he had ridden into these mountains looking for a life empty enough that losing it wouldn't hurt anyone, and had instead found a woman fierce enough to make him want a life worth risking again, whatever it cost him to keep it. Neither of them named it love outright, not that night, because both of them had learned the hard way what love could cost, but the space between them by the fire had closed, at last, to almost nothing at all, and neither one moved to open it back up again. The ride down out of the San Mateos toward the Black Range took the better part of 4 days, and Winona grew quieter with every mile, watching the country change from high pine to the rougher scrub she remembered from childhood with an expression Holt couldn't fully read. Grief and hope tangled together so tightly neither one could be pulled loose from the other. She had not seen her surviving kin in 6 weeks, had not known until the trader's report reached them whether there was anyone left alive to find, and Holt understood, riding a half-length behind her the way he had since that first difficult ride down off the ridge, with her wound barely closed, that this homecoming carried a weight his own presence could only complicate, whatever welcome he hoped for at the end of it. Word of Cole's death reached the surviving remnant of Winona's band before Winona herself did, carried by a trader who passed through the mountains 2 weeks later, and when Winona finally rode down out of the high country at Holt's side to find what remained of her people scattered into a smaller camp near the Black Range, she was met first with disbelief, and then slowly with a wary welcome that Holt understood he would have to earn on his own terms rather than expect freely given. Her uncle, a cautious, weathered man who had taken on leadership of the scattered band since her father's death, studied Holt for a long, silent while before asking Winona directly, in front of the whole gathered camp, whether this rancher understood what he was asking for if he meant to stand beside her permanently. Because her people had buried too many promises made by white men to accept an easy one. Now, Holt cut in before Winona could, plain and without polish, that he wasn't asking to take anything from anyone, only to stand where she stood for as long as she'd have him, in her world or his or wherever the two happened to meet, and something in the flat honesty of it more than any grand gesture could have managed seemed to settle a portion of the old man's doubt. Her uncle set Holt one further test before the camp's wary welcome turned into anything warmer, a task rather than a speech, asking him to ride out with 2 of the band's younger men to recover a string of horses Cole's crew had scattered during their retreat from the mountains weeks before. It was hard, unglamorous work over 3 cold days, and Holt did it without complaint or any expectation of praise, returning every last horse he could find and asking nothing in return, and it was that quiet, unshowy competence that finally moved her uncle to sit with him at the fire as an equal, rather than an outsider being tolerated for Winona's sake. By the time the horses were counted and returned, a camp had begun in small, unspoken ways, folding Holt into its daily rhythm, an older woman mending his torn coat without being prompted, children losing their fear of him within a week and trailing him around camp, peppering him with questions about his strange, hairless cattle. A place made for him at the fire that no one bothered explaining was now simply his. Not every voice in that camp softened toward Holt as readily as her uncle's did. A younger man named Taji, who had loved someone from the band killed in the same raid that took Winona's father, made his suspicion of Holt plain every time the two of them crossed paths. Cold and unapologetic in a way Holt understood better than he resented. Winona did not ask Holt to win Taji over, and did not apologize for him either, telling Holt plainly that some wounds in her people were still too fresh for patience, and that Taji's anger, however uncomfortable, belonged to him, honestly, and deserved to be left alone rather than smoothed over for a stranger's comfort. Holt took the lesson as she gave it, kept his distance where distance was wanted, and found by the second month that simple unbothered patience did more to ease Taji's guard than any effort at winning him over ever could have. The winter that followed was not an easy one, marked by the slow, unglamorous work of two worlds learning to overlap without either one swallowing the other whole. Holt learning enough of Winona's language to speak with her uncle without an interpreter. Winona spending long weeks at the ranch learning the rhythms of cattle and fence line, even as she made plain every single day that she was not becoming a different woman to fit inside his life, only adding his life to the one she already carried. Holt built her not a cage but a door that opened both directions, riding with her back to her people's camp as often as the season allowed, and it was there, the following spring, in front of both her family and the small handful of ranch hands and neighbors who had ridden up to stand witness, that Holt put the question to her in the plainest words he owned, promising not to tame her, only to stand at her side while she remained exactly as fierce as the day he'd first found her bleeding and unbowed in a hollow between two rocks. Winona did not soften for the asking. She met him the way she met everything, chin up, eyes steady, a fierceness that had never once left her even in the moment her answer finally came, and the two of them were married that spring, under a sky the color of the mountains where they'd first fought each other to a standstill. The ceremony borrowed from both their worlds. Rather than erasing either one, her uncle gave the words her people used to bind two lives together, and a circuit judge who'd ridden up from the nearest town supplied the words the territory required for the marriage to stand in any courthouse, and Winona wore over a simple pale dress. A beaded belt her mother had made her years before the raid, the one possession she had managed to save and carry through 6 days alone in the mountains. Holt's few remaining kin did not come, having made their opinions about the match plain enough in letters he chose not to answer, but the ranch hands who had known him through 2 years of quiet grief rode up in their good shirts anyway and stood shoulder to shoulder with a band of Chihen relatives none of them had ever expected to call family, sharing one long table built from planks hauled up by mule for the occasion. Taji rode up to the ranch himself the following autumn, a full year after the fight at the line shack, uninvited and unannounced, and stood in the yard a long while before he finally allowed, gruffly, that he'd come to see for himself whether a white rancher's promises held up past the wedding day. He did not stay for supper that first visit, but he came back the next season, and the one after that, and by the time Holt and Winona's daughter was old enough to run shrieking across the yard at the sight of his horse, Taji had become, without either man ever naming it directly, something close to an uncle to her, all proof that the wariness a person carried honestly could soften in its own time, on its own terms, without ever being rushed or forced. Holt never did get the solitude he'd ridden up into the San Mateos, chasing that autumn, and in the years that followed, watching Winona teach their own daughter to read tracks and set a snare line before the girl had learned to read a book, he came to understand that he had never actually wanted the silence at all. He had wanted, without knowing how to ask for it, someone fierce enough to stand beside him inside it, and in a wounded, snarling, unbreakable woman who had once put a knife to his throat rather than be pitied, he had found her. Winona, for her part, never did stop watching the tree line at dusk out of old habit, never did fully set down the weariness 6 days alone in those mountains had carved into her, but she stopped needing to watch it alone, and on the ranch she'd once refused to be tamed by. She built in her own time and on her own fierce terms. A second home to stand beside the one Cole's riders had burned, carrying both inside her for the rest of her life without ever once apologizing for either. She taught their daughter both her languages, both her worlds, and made certain the girl grew up understanding that fierceness and tenderness had never once been opposites, only two names for the same stubborn, unbreakable love. We hope Holt and Winona's story stayed with you the way it stayed with us in the telling. If you enjoy stories like this one, become a channel member by tapping join beside the channel name. It helps us keep telling stories exactly like theirs. And if you're not ready for that yet, a like and a subscribe help this story find the next person who needs it just as much. Thank you for riding along with us, and we'll see you in the next one.